Hello friends, now we are going to see about a simple vocabulary about the reproduction in flowering plants. So what are the terminologies we have to be known? So if you know the terminologies, now the topic will be very easy. So now we are going to see about flower and what are the parts of the flower, what are the terminologies is given for the flower parts. So what is flower exactly? The sexual reproductive structure we call it as flower, which produces egg and sperm. Fertilization takes place inside the flower. So this is the attractive part of the plant which we call it as flower. So this colored portion which we call it as petals, which will attract the insects for pollination. And next, now we are going to see the parts of flower. So importantly, from the parts of flower we have to go from the lower to the upper side or upper to the lower side. Now we are going from the lower. So this we call it as the stalk, we call it as peduncle, and this bulge part which we call it as receptacle, which means also call it as thalamus. And next, this green colored portion which we call it as sepals, so which encloses the flower during the budding stage, and this colored part which we call it as petals, right? So this for attracting the insects and certain insects and birds for pollination. And now we are going to see mainly about female reproductive and male reproductive. First is female reproductive. In the center we can able to see this green color part which is nothing but pistil. So if the flower is pistillated flower means that is female flower. What are the parts of the pistil means? Stigma, style, ovary. Inside the ovary we have the ovules which is nothing but the egg. So we again will see the vocabulary in detail. Pistil. So the parts of pistil is stigma, top of the pistil, the sticky surface for pollen to stick on. So that's why we call it a stigma. Style connects the stigma to the ovary. The center portion we call it a style. And next, ovary, which contains the ovules, nothing but the eggs. So inside this ovary we have the eggs. Next, we are going to see about male reproductive organ, which we call it as stamen. If the flower is staminated flowers means male flowers. So in certain flowers we have the both female as well as male. Now, the parts of stamen are anther and filament. So, what is anther? Which produces the sperm by meiosis, which we call it as anther. Filament, nothing but which links up with the anther, elongated portion, we call it as filament. So, both are the parts of the stamen. Now, coming to in detail vocabulary, stamen, anther, which produces the sperm nuclei by meiosis. Sperm nuclei are enclosed by pollen grains. Next, filaments, which holds the anther up. So these are all the parts of the flower. Next, pollination. Transfer of mature pollen grain from the anther to the stigma. We call it as this process, we call it as pollination. Through wind, insects, birds and other animals also will work for pollination. So the major area to attract the to attract these insects, birds and other animals is colored sepals. Colored petals. Coming to the pollination, in this picture it is very colorful and clear that, so from the anther to the stigma. So one part of the flower which we call it as anther, which makes the pollen, it is clear. From the anther, the pollen is being transferred towards the stigma of the other flower or the same flower. So another part of the flower which we call it as pistil, so which will leads to eggs. Now when the pollen is being attached to this from here to here, this process alone is called it as pollination. It can be happen through wind, birds, insects and certain animals. When the pollen grain lands on the stigma, it germinates and the pollen tube grows down through the style through to the ovule or the egg. So for example, in this picture it is clearly shown that when the pollen grains falls on the stigma, it develops a long tube which we call it as pollen tube. Now the pollen tube is extending till the ovule for for fertilization. So this whole thing will be, if you can able to see here, we have the three pollen grains. It is been extending, so it is been growing towards the ovary. And next, fertilization. What exactly the meaning of fertilization? The sperm travel through the pollen tube to the ovule. So the sperm and egg fuse to form the zygote, which is a fertilized egg. So this grows into a plant embryo. Cells grow by mitosis. So now we are going to see what happens after fertilization. So what happens after pollination means nothing but fertilization. So in this picture, this is the flower with petals, pistil and stamen. Pistil is the female reproductive organ, stamens are the male reproductive organ. Now inside we have the generative nucleus, which is very important, nothing but sperms. So this generative nuclei is present inside the pollen grain. The pollen grain consists of two layers, exine and intine. Exine is porous and the intine is the very important layer which forms the pollen tube. So it is inside. How it forms the pollen tube means the intine will comes out through the pores of the exine. So now the pollen tube formation is being takes place. It is being divided into, we have the three nuclei here. So the generative nucleus will divide to form two sperm nuclei. So we have one more nutritive nucleus. Okay. So now the pollen tube is in extending towards the ovary. Inside the ovary it is been extended towards the ovule, nothing but eggs. So this is the embryonic sac. Inside the embryonic sac we have 7-celled and 8 nucleated stage. What are that 7-celled and 8 nucleated stage means? In the lower we have the either side we have the lower 3 cells. In these 3 cells, this either 2 we call it as synergids. In the center only we will have the egg cell. Center of this we have 2 nuclei and single cell, which we call it as endosperm cell, endospermic cell. So with central cell with endospermic nuclei, and in the above we have the antipodal cells. So these are the cells is being present inside the embryonic sac. Now the pollen grain will extend, the pollen tube will extend towards this, and the two generative nuclei, one will fuse with this egg cell and other will fuse with this endospermic nuclei. And next, self-pollination. Pollen from the same flower, which we call it as self-pollination. Cross-pollination. Pollen from the different flower, we call it as cross-pollination. Cross-pollination will be happen in the unisexual or bisexual flowers. The ovary and zygote, which is nothing but fertilized ovule, develop and ripen. Now the ovule forms the seeds and the ovary forms the fruit. So fruit is nothing but ripened ovary. Technically we call the fruit, so which is nothing but ripened ovary. Okay, these are the very important vocabulary we have to know before going into the reproduction of flowering plant. So I hope you all understood. Thank you very much. Please do like, share, comment and subscribe to my channel.